Right, let's move on to happier thoughts, shall we? The weather's turned out nice at last, hasn't it? It's been dry, it's been warm, even, dare I say it, almost, perhaps, T-shirt weather, certainly where we are today. But there is always, of course, a price to pay for this kind of pleasure. And there are extreme wildfire warnings in place right now across large chunks of the country. I'll be more precise about that. Across the east, across the centre, across the north and across the southwest of Scotland, which you will have deduced means there's not much of the country that's not covered by an extreme wildfire warning at the moment. These fires might not have the devastating kind of human impact of the recent ones in California a few months ago, but should we be worried about the changing conditions, the unpredictable weather patterns that create these threats of fire and flood that we hear so much about these days? Let's ask a couple of people who will know about all this stuff. With me in the studio is Laura Young, friend of the pod and climate activist. Hi, Laura.
Hello.
And joining us from Edinburgh is Rory Hadden, Professor of Fire Science from Edinburgh University. Rory, hello.
Hi there.
Professor of Fire Science. We've known about fire for a fair while now as humans. What do we say? We're still learning, though, are we?
Absolutely, we're still learning. My research and the research of our team here at Edinburgh covers a whole bunch of topics related to fire safety, things that we hope most people don't have to think about on their day-to-day existence. But we work on, making buildings fire safe and understanding fire risks in buildings, but also, as we're talking about today, the evolving risk of wildfires in the UK.
Right. So there is this extreme warning, and it's not the first. Over the last 3 weeks, there have been 3 or 4 across vast swathes of the country. So what's going on? What are the conditions that are combining to create this? Because people will be heading to the hills as well in this kind of holiday period, won't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is quite a normal time for us to see some of these extreme fire danger warnings. The spring weather, we have this beautiful weather, as you mentioned at the top. Great, nice sunny days. And it's really, though, the low humidity that we've been experiencing that has been the key thing here. The vegetation on the hillsides, the plants that are growing there, many of them are still dormant. There's lots of last year's growth that's dead, kind of just in amongst all the vegetation. And the dormant plants, the dead vegetation, that stuff dries out really fast when we have these periods of low humidity. So really that's what's driving this fire danger assessment is the moisture content of these fuels, which is just really low, and obviously therefore they're very susceptible to ignition. Once a fire starts, then it's going to spread, and we also have some pretty high indices there on the spread danger as well. So the fires are going to be easy to start, and once they do start, they're going to get out of control pretty quickly.
Laura, I was looking at some statistics around this, right? And this is where the climate stuff really does come into play. 64% of our average rainfall in March. We're on the 10th of April now, and I don't know about you, I haven't seen a drop of rain, I don't think, so far this month. Or at least if I have, I can't remember it. I mean, again, I can hear people out there saying, yeah, but you get years like this, don't you? I remember the summer of 76, the Great Drought. That was before anybody was talking about climate change.
Yeah. And first of all, I feel like getting out the way. Every time it's a sunny day, I feel bad because I'm the climate person coming out going, I know it's really lovely, but we need to talk about this. But it is important. And actually, your point hits the nail on the head because we have the science and the stats and the history and the records of how temperature has changed, how rainfall has changed, how our weather is changing over time, which is what we call climate change. And it's difficult because people then go, but when I grew up, it felt really warm and now it doesn't feel that warm. And we're almost competing with people's memories or feelings, or even feelings of last year. They go, oh, well, last year it didn't feel like a good summer, so where's this global warming? But it's important to recognise when we put it down on paper, when we put it on graphs, where we look at it, we are seeing warmer, drier springs and summers, and actually wetter and wilder winters. But often that is becoming more unpredictable, and we're seeing it in these kind of more frequent and extreme storms as well. So we've got these competing things that are happening during the different seasons throughout the year. And absolutely what we are now trying to grapple with is where wildfires might have been partly natural. We are now seeing them more. They are becoming more frequent, more extreme. And also we don't really know how to live beside them. And as you've said, this also impacts rainfall. And what does rainfall help us with? Everything. drinking water. So we've also got bits of Scotland experiencing drought and then having to work out where do we get water from if our private water supplies, particularly for people who are in more rural communities, how do we get them the access to water that they need when it is this really lovely weather that we enjoy, but when that has a really big impact on communities.
How worried look, we're worried about flood, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute, because there will be an inevitable deluge at some point soon, given the time of year, one would imagine, and that will fall on bone dry, brittle ground. It won't be able to sink in, it will run off, it will find its way down the hills and into our valleys and then into our towns, right? But how worried... So there's the flood concern, but you brought up the D word, right?
Yeah.
Drought. How worried should we be about drought? What are your charts and patterns telling you about this?
Well, let's go to somewhere that experiences drought quite frequently now, Aberdeenshire. There have been hundreds of households that are on these private water supplies that are in the more rural areas that regularly are running dry. Now, absolutely, you should be very worried if you live in these communities about drought, but not too worried, because of course we will help. We will step in. The government steps in with Scottish Water to provide water for you. So nobody is going to go without things like fresh water. We will deal with it. But what we do need to be worried about is the increasing cost and frequency of that. It's hundreds of thousands of pounds for local councils to deal with when water runs dry. And I think that's a really important thing that we need to be worried about. Not necessarily worried that we're going to completely run out and people will be going thirsty, but actually the impacts that places like Aberdeenshire and other areas that have this drop in the level of water, that's something to be concerned about.
We've had the head of Scottish Water on, actually, in
Yeah.
a really interesting episode, which you can find further up the
Upstream?
list on this further upstream on your podcast flow. Yeah, exactly. Rory, listen, it would be trite of me perhaps to just say, look, you need some of the wet stuff to put on the hot stuff as well when the fires start. But could we do with damping areas when nature's not doing that for us? Does this all play into that? What can we do to mitigate against fire?
Really becomes a thing about engineering the landscape to recognise that we have this threat of wildfires. And you can engineer the landscape. There's numerous ways of doing it. Other parts of the world use techniques like prescribed burning. So there will be deliberate fires set by experienced, qualified, trained people who understand what they're doing, and they will be managed and allowed to burn in a way that clears out some vegetation. We do this in Scotland. It's a relatively controversial in some circles practice called muir burn. And that's done in many locations. And doing that and understanding how to do that and optimize that, so when you do this, quite dangerous activity, let's be honest, we're setting fire to a hillside, you can get the maximum benefit for that. You can create a fire break. You can give the fire service or whoever's fighting that fire options. Am I going to try and direct this fire in the direction where I know I have a good fire break that I burned out or I maintained last year? You can also do those sorts of things, making those fire breaks. You can do it with mechanical means. You can go in and cut fire breaks and these sorts of things. And landowners and estate managers and people who are working on these tracts of land, they are doing that. They have risk assessments, they plan for these sorts of things. But I think we can do more, and I think we can probably do a little bit more in terms of the research and the development and to support those sorts of decision-making things. Because these events, they also have costs. If you go in and you start manipulating the natural environment, it's a complicated system, and you might not quite get the desired outcome you want, and you might accidentally upset some other part of the ecosystem. So we really need to think carefully and have these conversations and bring in all the stakeholders, so we're not always just on the back foot, fighting the fires, because that's a really not great thing to be doing. But we actually have got some management of the landscape that gives us the options as we see this evolving risk.
I do also want to add that we all have a role when it comes to fire safety, particularly when we're out and enjoying nature. Barbecues, disposable barbecues, enjoying picnics on the beach, on the hills. We have a responsibility.
Even glass bottles, right?
Even glass bottles. So glass bottles, if anyone doesn't know, because if you didn't see that public safety video that was going around, they basically act like a magnifying glass. And if that is left littered, you might be way far away from it, but it can heat up around and that can spark a flame. Also, disposable barbecues. If you're at the beach, just keep away from things like sand dunes. Really try and keep any sort of naked flames or barbecues way down onto the beach, close to the water if possible, because it only takes one little spark to ignite something and it can cause a really big issue. And if there aren't police or fire service or other community people around, that can have a big impact. But we've also seen things like the Jacobite train has actually been cancelled and because of the spark risk.
What, over Glenfinnan Viaduct?
Yeah, so what they've done is they've replaced the front of it to just a diesel generated train to continue the route, but obviously not as picturesque as the Hogwarts Express. But they've had to do that because of the spark risk, because again, think of all that line of trail, all that railway, all that area of remoteness, one little spark can catch. So we also have a role to play in thinking of tidying up after ourselves, not setting fires near anything too dry, and just being mindful of that.
Rory was talking about kind of using the environment to protect the environment, Muirburn, that kind of stuff. Talk to me, Laura, just briefly, if you would, about using the environment to protect flood risk. And I kind of know a little bit about this because whenever there was a flood down in Hebden Bridge, which is a notoriously frequently flooded little town in the northwest of England, I used to end up getting sent down there to cover it. And eventually they struck upon this idea, right, that you should plant trees about 30 miles upstream in a completely different part of the country, because that's where the water would begin its journey. And if you could create a kind of spongy terrain up there, less of it would come down. I spoke to people about doing that in Scotland recently, and they said, well, it's different because there's one agency that covers the whole thing in England. If you've got a flood in Musselburgh, you're asking people to plant trees in the Pentlands. It's a different council. East Lothian Council says, Middle Lothian Council, do you want to plant some trees? They say, no, we're going to build a new school roof. It's not happening. Is there enough joined up thinking going on here about that kind of stuff?
No, absolutely not. So as you say, what we need to have is a catchment approach. So we need to look at a river catchment, and that often crosses council boundaries. So we do need to be talking a lot more to each other and saying, areas which are, Granton or these areas that you've talked about, where you then need to go up the catchment and actually say, what can we be doing? So we need to do a lot more of that, because often when somewhere floods, we just look locally and go, well, what could we do? Now, we also need to be working towards more nature-based solutions. And as you say, planting trees upstream is one part of that. But we also need to be looking at urban centres, which are concrete jungles. And we've done very poor planning in the past. And looking at how we can make that, one of the concepts is a sponge city. And actually, how can we make even urban centres absorb more water? And there is areas of Scotland that we would go to that are at risk of flooding, but actually 1 in 11 properties is at risk of flooding and 1 in 7 businesses. So it's more people than you think who are at risk of flooding.
See, that should focus the mind, right? But so should LA burning down. And then you've still got a president of the States who's saying, drill, baby, drill. What is it? We kept hearing, right, that people would start paying attention and change their behaviour on this when it started impacting their own lives, when it wasn't theoretical, it was practical. Do you still think that'll happen? Do you still think that's true? What's it going to take to make everybody sit up and do something?
I think it's sharing people's personal stories, and a lot of people who have been flooded or have been experiencing these negative environmental impacts near them go, well, I never thought it would happen to me. So part of it is about sharing that, but also it's about trying to get people to know that there's resources out there. So SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, has a flood risk map. There we go. You can put your postcode in and you can actually go and have a look and find out. You can sign up to Floodline, which is where you will get alerts when your area is going to be flooded, and you can get information from the Scottish Flood Forum about what to do. So people need to understand, and they can go put their postcode in and find out more. But also I think we need to be platforming the communities that have been impacted to actually hear about what it is. I was just speaking to a girl the other day who got flooded during Storm Babette, and she was sharing passionately her story about that she didn't, first of all, know she was at risk of flooding, but also she didn't have any insurance. And so for her, it was not just the devastating thing of having your house flooded, it was then realising I have to rebuild from this, and I didn't even have insurance because I didn't know. So it's about sharing those stories so that people wake up and understand it a bit more.
I remember filming in the aforementioned Hebden Bridge and seeing a guy mopping out his ruined shop, and I said to him, this is a disaster. What's your business? He said, I'm the insurance broker. I said, well, you'll be all right. He said, I'm not. I couldn't get insurance. Nobody will insure us here anymore. So even the insurance guy
and
wasn't
can I also
insured.
Just, on the insurance point, I also think it's important because a lot of people, when we talk about climate adaptation or climate resilience or net zero, if we use those words, they say, oh, it's costing a fortune, this is costing the taxpayer, and this is ridiculous. Storm Babette has been estimated to have costed Scotland, in insurance terms, £450 million. So the cost of not doing anything about wildfires, about extreme heat, about flooding is way more than the cost is now for us trying to adapt. And that's a really key thing to remember.
All right, Rory, Laura, we must leave it there. Thank you both very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And that is it for another episode of Scotcast. We are going to take a little break for a few days now. Don't begrudge us it, because we've done a bit of work in the run-up to that as well. Don't worry. Next week we'll be dropping back in your feeds as usual with a new little mini-series. We're calling it Take Two, and we're revisiting some of the subjects that we've already covered with a slightly different angle on them. That'll be there next week. We'll be back the week after. We'll see you then. Thanks for being with us, as ever. Bye-bye.